My name is Dan Sullivan. I'm a principal solutions architect here at Itential. I've been with Itential for about 2 years, and prior to that, I spent a number of years at Cisco and then another company, largely focused on network automation. Here at Itential, I've been working in a customer-facing pre and post-sales role. Um, and I spend the majority of my time in software development. And that's really where I first sort of got introduced to automation. Here at Itential, I work with enterprise and service provider Itential customers in pre and post sales capacity. Now, I've spoken with a number of customers regarding automation, and most, if not all, customers have done some work around automation. They might have developed Python scripts or Ansible playbooks or Terraform plans. And they're always concerned as to whether they can continue to leverage the investments that they've already made, while adopting technology like the Itential Automation Platform. And so in today's discussion, we'll focus on how Itential can enable customers not only to leverage their existing assets, but actually make them, a bit more accessible in an automation environment. First, as we get started, I have a couple of slides that'll help sort of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. Why democratize scripts? I think at Itential you often hear the phrase "the right tool for the right job." What does that really mean? I think basically it means that enterprise and service provider customers have to employ different tools to solve and meet automation requirements. In a lot of respects, it's really an antiquated idea that one tool is going to solve every problem that you have from an automation perspective. It's more likely than not that you need to consider using multiple tools and multiple different systems to help solve the automation use cases that are most important to you. In terms of bring your own automation, I sort of alluded to that earlier, and that it just means that, hey, how can we leverage expertise that already exists within a team and an organization and try to expand the reach and effectiveness of what they've done? And one way to do that is helping them leverage the artifacts that they've already created and sort of expand the reach of that. A lot of times people develop Python scripts or some other kind of scripts and Ansible playbooks to solve specific problems. But a lot of times it's really difficult to create that that substantial end-to-end automation combining disparate scripts, especially if they've been created by different teams. And so using the Itential Automation Platform, we can start to integrate those scripts and make them part of larger end-to-end automations. And more importantly, we can sort of leverage the expertise where it exists today in your organization. Some tools are limited, right? I mean, for example, even something as simple as input validation for scripts and playbooks, it's usually overlooked. I'm certainly guilty of that myself. You build a Python script and it takes the data that you're familiar with and forces it into the script, and you would never enter the wrong thing, but then some other user who's less familiar with your particular script might not be as clear about what's required. And so as part of the demo, we'll look at how the Itential Automation Platform and the Itential Automation Gateway can help increase the effectiveness of the scripts that you have and even make them a little bit easier to use. So in terms of expanding automation participation, taking your scripts that you've developed and make them a little bit more accessible so that people don't necessarily can actually run the tools that you've built without logging on to your script server and understanding the ins and outs of your environment and what needs to be done. They can actually leverage Itential, and Itential in turn can provide access to your scripts and playbooks that you've developed. So that people can leverage those without necessarily becoming an expert in Ansible or, Python script design or something like that. In terms of a demo, so The demo kind of has two main pieces. Number one is the Itential Automation Platform. Um, and then the second part is the Itential Automation Gateway. So we'll actually leverage the Itential Automation Gateway to onboard some existing automation assets, and then we'll decorate them, and we'll actually test this from the Itential Automation Platform. So once we've onboarded the scripts and discovered them appropriately, then we'll build some workflows to actually access them and sort of see that end to end. And lastly, we'll have a little bit of a more comprehensive workflow we can take a look at and see how we can integrate more fully and more effectively with scripts that we might have developed. So with that, I think we're done with the slides, and we'll just sort of jump into the demo and get started. So let me just share my screen briefly here. Let's see. Screen 2. All right. So before we get started, I'll just expand briefly about the script that we're going to focus on today. So I'll actually bring up a copy of that. So recently, I was testing out some Ansible playbooks that sort of actually install the Itential platform itself. And to actually use the script, to use the Ansible playbook, so I had to create a number of EC2 instances within an AWS cloud, within an AWS VPC, get a bunch of information for them, and then create sort of an Ansible inventory for the Ansible playbooks to use as they went through the installation process. I did that a few times, and then I got really tired of cutting and pasting. So I decided, all right, I'm going to write a Python script that will go off, spin up my assets in EC2 the way that I want them, and will gather some information. So this is basically the script that I came up with. It's a few hundred lines of Python, nothing too spectacular. You'll see here the arguments for the script itself. Now, this version of the script I've actually already onboarded, but what I did is I actually made a copy of it so we can go through the onboarding process. You'll see why I did it that way in a little bit later on. But at this point, the main thing about the script is you give it a file, and the file sort of describes the cluster or the set of EC2 instances you want to create. And so I'll just kind of give you a quick peek at that. So for example, I have a cluster here called Itential Test. And when I spin it up, I create these EC2, whatever servers are defined here, I create EC2 instances for each one, and I append the server name plus the prefix. So if I go into my account today, you'll see I have already spun up this file that we're looking at here. So for the purposes of the demo, at least for the initial part, I've already kind of spun this up. But now you'll see I'm actually logged in to the IAG instance, and I'm on the Linux server that's housing the IAG instance. And in this case, I'm in user share scripts, and this is the directory in which the Itential Automation Gateway will look to onboard new scripts. And so the script that I'm going to onboard today already exists in the directory, but it's called the AAA-cluster-op.py. It's basically a copy of a script that I've already onboarded called cluster-op, but this is the one that we're going to onboard today. So the first thing that we're going to do, now that we have the script located in the directory where the gateway can actually see the script, is we can actually log into the automation gateway, and I'm right here. We can go to scripts, and you'll see here that that my script doesn't exist. So one thing I can do, and I could actually do this from the Itential Automation platform, is I can actually make a call to tell it to refresh its script cache. So I'm just going to do that. So there's a bunch of the API calls here. I go down to scripts and hit this one here, refresh the script cache. I'll try it out, hit execute. And it should be, looks like it worked okay. Said it worked. So now I can go back up here. If I go back down to scripts, I can get a list of the scripts that it thinks it knows about now. So I'll try that one. I'll hit execute again. Let's see. And now you see it actually found my script a cluster up, so it knows about that. So if I go back to the excuse me, the Itential Automation Gateway and refresh it, I should see that script pop up. So let's see here. Give it a second. All right. So if I go back to scripts, you'll see now that that script is actually onboarded. So if I click on it here, I can actually run that script now from my Itential. So if I want to execute it here, I can give the argument list. Now, in this case, I got to kind of remember all those switches over here that I need. But in this case here, what I'm going to do is I actually know that if I just give it a -H, it'll give me the help for the script, and that'll at least prove that it's running. So let's see what happens here. Yep. So it looks like it ran. It spit out all the different arguments to the script that I might need. But frankly, this is a bit of a pain because now anybody that wants to use my script needs to know that, give it the -F and then give it the location of the cluster file and all that stuff. And that's kind of a pain. So I think the next thing that we're going to do is actually try to do what we call, which is decorating the script itself. So we can actually we can sort of tell the gateway, hey, when we onboard the script, here's the variables that it needs, and we can sort of map that to almost a JSON schema. So the way to do that is we can then go to what we call the parameters here. So if I go here to the parameters here, right now it just says an argument list and the environment variables. And the thing here is, again, you have to know all those arguments that we just spit out. That's kind of a pain. So if I click edit, what I can do is I actually have this kind of pre-cooked, but I'm going to explain it to you in just a second here. So I'm going to replace what's here from a properties perspective with a more decorated one. And I'll show you this in just a second. I'm just cutting and pasting from another screen. So now if I take this, I replace it. Now what I've done here is I've defined some properties, and these are the arguments that I'm interested in. So for example, I want people to specify the cluster file. And if they do that, I give a little bit of a description. I tell the type it is. I define, and here's the prefix that they need, that Itential needs to give the script, which is going to be a -F. So every time it prompts for the file, it's going to put a -F because that's the right way to use the script. I have another script here that I can actually pass the entire cluster data. Instead of giving it a file, I can give it a JSON and I can give it in a string if I want. So in a JSON encoded string, and I'll show you why we're going to do that. And there's a few operations. I have create, delete, and check. So these will just be Booleans. If you select these arguments, it will create the cluster. If you select delete, it will delete it. But now I have these arguments defined, and I even can specify the argument order that I want. So now I kind of have this saved off. So I can just hit save here. All right. So now you'll see that I have these arguments saved. So when I go to execute the script, it looks a little different. Well, actually, first I have to refresh it. Let's see. I just got to refresh my browser cache. It always takes a second when I do this. All right. So now the first thing you'll notice here is that this blue triangle next to the script, and that means that it has an active decoration. So the script's been decorated. So if I go to execute now, you'll see it looks a little bit different, right? I have the file argument. I have to specify the file. I know that the file will be located in home, Itential, cluster.json. That's the file I have. I can execute just to check. Well, that's probably good enough. Now I can just run this and let's see what happens. So that looks like it's okay. There's a bunch of text there that's not so readable, but it went out to AWS and read that information. So again, if I go and look at my EC2 instances, it went out and found these instances and reported some of the data for me. So that's the good news. Now we've got the script onboarded into Itential, so that's good, into the gateway, but we still actually have to get the script. We need the Itential Automation Platform to understand that the script is present as well. So the first way that we do that is just going to Itential here, and we're going to restart the adapter. So there's an adapter here. Let's see. 1 second. So we're going to restart this adapter here in just a second. But before I do, I'm actually going to go into let's see here. If I go into the Automation Studio here and I search for AAA, it actually already has discovered the script here. So that's pretty good. So it already knows about the script. I'm just going to make sure that I refresh the adapter just to make sure that it gets the full decoration in there. Let's see what happens. Let's give it a second or two to refresh. All right. And now I'll go into here. So I've got this little workflow that I already created. And if I search for that script again, oh, I have to refresh the screen. I think. I have an Itential running on a really small VM for the purposes of this demo, so it's a little slow. Let's give it a second here. Okay. So let's see here now if I can find that AAA. Okay, so now the script has showed up. So if I click on this, I should be able to drag this onto the canvas. And I can even connect it in if I want. So now you can see from Itential, when I want to actually execute this script, I have these arguments now that I can fill in. And for this one, I already know that I'm going to do home Itential JSON. This is kind of a pain in the neck, and we're going to kind of deal with this in a bit. And maybe I'll just execute a check, which means I'll go off and check the status of this cluster. So let's do that. Now it turns out that I already have this query set up. So if I point the query at the script, it'll take the output of that script and query it out, and we should be able to see it in a human readable form. So I'm just going to save this, and I'll just run it from here. So let's see what happens. Okay, so it looks like it already ran the script and it got to here. So let's see what happens. If I hit auto work, that task should pop up. And so now you can see it went out, executed the script. It got it's got the information about the AWS ID, the state, the public and private IP, and even the private DNS that I need. And this is sort of the information that I would need actually to actually, to actually pump all this stuff into my Ansible playbook. So that's good. So we can let that finish. So, all right, so now we've successfully onboarded the script and we got some human readable data out of it. And I have for the rest of the demo, I'm actually going to use the same version, the version of this that I onboarded earlier. And I'll because I didn't want to necessarily, I wouldn't have had the time to build some of these workflows dynamically in front of you guys. So let's see. So over here, so we don't need this one here. Here I'm going to run that same script. It's called just by a different name. I'm going to show you a couple of different things that you can do. So in this case here, I'm going to run the script up top. I'm going to execute the script up top, but I'm going to give it some slightly different arguments. I'm going to give it the name. I'm going to execute the diff command, the disk-based command on each of the instances, and I'm going to report the data. And I'm actually going to do it in JSON. So I have a little argument to this script that allows me to force the output into JSON. And so the reason why I want to do that is because it's actually going to be a lot easier for me to take this data and create a JSON object. So that way, if this was part of a more comprehensive workflow and I wanted to utilize that data, it's going to be a lot easier to take that data and parse it in JSON format versus actually trying to scrape it, based off of text output. So because my Python script can spit stuff out in JSON format, I can do that. And then on the bottom, I'll just run the more traditional way. So let's see what happens. So I'll just run it from here. There's no real data recorded, everything's spilled out. Okay, so it looks like the top half of this ran successfully, and the bottom half is stopped at a manual task here. So if we just hit auto work, that task should pop up. We should be able to see the same output. So in this case, we got some information about about those instances in AWS, and then we dynamically went out to each of those and issued a command. So I just gave it the Linux df command. It's reporting on the file system, so I can see how much space I have on all these particular systems, and it looks like I'm in pretty good shape. So they're all reporting the data here. So everything looks pretty good. But of course, if I wanted to consume any of this further on in the automation, it would be hard to screen scrape everything out of this table. So again, what I did was I actually, so we can just cancel out of this for now. I actually went over here and I did the same thing, but I got the output and I had the script outputted in JSON format. So now when I look at this, you'll see that this is basically it's going to be a JSON object. So if I can expand this, you'll see this. So now you can see that it's going to be a little bit easier now if I want to consume this programmatically. I've actually converted it to JSON, and I can actually easily manipulate this as part of my workflow. So just another thing to keep in mind if you're importing scripts and you want to make them more usable, one thing you can do is simply just output the data in JSON. It's pretty simple to do from Python, and really a worthwhile thing if you want to sort of expand the reach of this. One of the problems, though, that what we've been seeing the whole time is that whenever I run the script here, right, I had to specify this file, right, and so I could write an automation to where someone could take where I could take this data and write a new cluster file and try to use that, but that's kind of a pain as well. But I have another method in which this argument here, this JSON argument that I have here, in which if I pass input via JSON, then I could actually give a JSON encoded string that defines the cluster. And that might be a little bit more useful because during the while I'm working within Itential, I could actually start thinking about how could I could actually create a form and allow people to define what they wanted in their own cluster, and then kick it off to that script. So now I'll be actually able to drive, some fairly complex data. The cluster sort of definition kind of looks like this. So that's a fair amount of data to drive. I could have done it all with switches or something like that, but maybe it would be a little bit easier if we could do that within the confines of a JSON form. So let's take a look at how we might do that. So I have another automation here. Let's see, what's this one? So here's a slightly different automation. And in this one, it's going to it's front-ended with a form. It's going to take the information in the form and it's going to run the script and it's going to create some instances in AWS for me. It's going to wait a little bit for those instances to come alive. It's going to go off, check the status of them and report that. I'll even go off and give it another command and it should go off and check the um, check the file system again. So if we look at this one, let's see here. You'll see here it's just going to go off and execute the command here to just check the file system, and I'll report that back in a manual task here. And then lastly, it'll delete that. So we'll actually be able to see it, create it, and then later on we'll clean it up. But again, we need a form. So I've actually defined a form, and we can go to Operations Manager for that. So I'm within the Itential Operations Manager. If I search for cluster here, cluster creation here, I have a form already defined, and I can run this manually. And so I have a few nodes defined, but maybe I even decide, all right, I want to have another. I'm gonna add another row. In this case, I'm gonna have 3 IAP instances in this cluster. I'll call this IAP03. And so now I kind of have my data filled out, and I have my prefix defined. So what we should see is in AWS, we should see that we create all these AWS instances, and they're prefixed with the name of the instance will be the prefix, and then the host name, the server name that we have here. So I could just run this and kick it off, and let's see what happens. So it looks like it's trying to do this right now. Whoops, sorry, I zoomed down a little bit. And you'll notice here the first step was to determine whether or not it was successful, and it looks like it worked. And we're actually waiting here for AWS for a few seconds, probably a little bit longer than we needed to, and I can even hit the auto work button here in a second. And then we're going to go off and check to see the status of it. Looks like that's running now. So I ran the script once. I'm calling it a second time with a different set of arguments. And then let's see here. Now I'm at the manual task. So if I hit auto work, you should see the details. So it looks like it came up okay. And looks like we ran the diff command earlier too, but whatever. So, so everything looks pretty good. I can continue. Oh, it's got auto work. So now it's at the next manual task. And again, this time it just went off and checked the file systems. So now if I go into my instances and I refresh the screen, I should see them. So now you see the webinar, everything with webinar in front of it is what we just created. So it did indeed spin those up in AWS. And of course, like, hey, there's much more efficient ways to spin up resources in AWS, but I just happened to write a silly script to do this because it saves me a little bit of time. But I was able to actually onboard that into Itential and then actually run it. So it's pretty interesting to see that I could do that. So let's see here. So if I actually let it go, what we should see is it should go off and actually delete it. And you'll see now that the automation is complete. You'll see you can actually tell it's completed here. And then we've even and then Itential's actually grayed out some of the paths that it didn't take. And then if I go back to instances, I should see that my the instances I just created indeed are gone. They were deleted, so it cleaned them right up, and I can't see them anymore because I'm only looking at what's running. So we've actually been able to sort of interact with the script, pass it some data from the form, even though the script wasn't necessarily designed for that. Just having an argument where I could take that data in via a JSON string, I was actually able to get something useful out of it. And this just kind of gives you the basics of how you might choose to onboard a script and decorate it within Itential. There's one thing that we haven't talked about, and I thought maybe it was worthwhile to hit on this before we end. For Playbooks, for an Ansible playbook, it's a similar pattern. You just onboard it and decorate it in much the same fashion that we did here. And I think it's also interesting because we can start to map, once we have the schema for the script, we can actually match that to an external schema, and we can actually do some input validation before we actually let someone call the script. So we can further refine the data that we pass into the script and make sure that it's correct before we actually execute it. So as earlier in the process as we can validate our input is always a good thing. So the script decoration is definitely going to help with that. The other thing that I was going to point out here is if I go back to IAG and we look at the parameters again, you'll notice that here is the things that I chose to decorate. The other thing, though, is that my script itself has a bunch of different arguments. So, for example, I can actually specify the key path for the file that I used. I can actually specify what specific user I'm going to use when I execute the script. But I decided that I wouldn't expose those because I just want to use the default. I set up the Itential user. I set up the script server to use the right files and select the right user. So now users don't have access to that argument. There's no way for them to actually execute the script and use any arguments that I don't want them to use. So even though you might have built a particular script or a playbook in a specific way, you have the ability to control and sort of refine exactly the experience that people get when they use it in the confines of the Itential automation platform. I might even do things where I limit the size and scope of what they can input from a cluster format. I could do that within the form itself. So now I can actually really refine and prevent users from sort of digging themselves a hole. Now, there's one other thing that I could do is I could actually create, you could actually, if you wanted, you could onboard the same script multiple times. So you could, and then you could further reduce the arguments that way too. So you could onboard the same file several times so that you could only show them the arguments that they needed for a given operation. If they want to create a script, you would just show them. You could just have a task that only does the create, and it would just be hidden behind the decoration, and we'll go off and do the same thing. So that people can basically just do the basic operations the way that you want them to. So there's a bunch of different things that you can do to utilize decoration to more fully restrict and refine how people are using it. And so that's about it for the webinar today. Hope you guys got something out of it. And thanks for attending. And I think we'll have some future webinars that'll give a little bit more detail about how you might interface, using GitHub and things like that. But this one is more focused on the decoration. But thanks for attending. See you next time.